Transitions, the podcast by Ostrum Asset Management.
Welcome to the first episode of Ostrum Asset Management's new podcast, Transitions. Today's topic will resonate with the busy news cycle we are currently experiencing, both in France and abroad. The consideration of ESG in sovereign debt management. ESG is a set of environmental, social, and governance criteria in sovereign debt. In this case, the debt issued by countries. Halfway between COP28 in December 2023 and the next COP to be held in Azerbaijan in 6 months' time, the issue of how to finance transition through debt is back on the table. In the current macroeconomic context, the consideration of ESG criteria by national governments is under the spotlight. Several factors could influence countries' decisions as debt issuers as well as investors' appetite for this asset class. Firstly, the climate crisis and the commitments resulting from the Paris Agreement force governments to reduce carbon emissions in order to limit the rise in global temperature to 1.5 degrees. Despite this, the United Nations Environment Programme is already warning that current national trajectories could lead to a temperature rise of around 3 degrees by the end of the century, highlighting the massive investments and financing needed to achieve the energy transition which is required to meet these commitments. Secondly, the geopolitical and electoral context could play a role in the dynamics behind the climate transition, as 50% of the world's population of voting age goes to the polls in 2024. Newly elected governments will have to take key decisions on climate policies and their financing, and a shakeup in the political landscape could have a significant impact on global temperature trajectories. Lastly, investors are once again attracted to sovereign debt, with yields back in positive territory in the Eurozone and Japan. In this context, Ostrum Asset Management wanted to share its views on sovereign debt and ESG, whether it be the integration of ESG criteria into sovereign debt, asset managers' assessment of the quality of governments' approaches to ESG, or the attractiveness of this class for investors. Today we welcome Timothée Pubellier, Senior Portfolio Manager in Ostrum Asset Management's Alternative Assets team, and Léonie Ségala, SRI Analyst.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
So let's start off with one simple question. Has the global market for sovereign and quasi-sovereign debt truly embraced the ESG issue?
Yes, it has. ESG considerations are increasingly integrated into the sovereign debt market, as evidenced by the growing issuance of green bonds by national treasuries. While the first issues of this type date back to 2017, led by France and Fiji Island, there are now 25 countries issuing sustainable bonds, the majority of which are OECD countries. Some emerging market players, such as Nigeria, India, and Indonesia, have also launched issuance programs. This trend is driven by the desire to attract ESG-conscious investors and to benefit from the lower borrowing costs associated with green bonds. I'll add that sovereign issuers' growing interest in ESG is reflected in the breakdown of sustainable bonds between different types of issuer, with the share of sovereign bond issuer rising steadily. It has risen by 66% in 2023. This shows that local treasuries are relying on ESG to improve their financial capacity, even though sustainable bonds still represent only a small fraction of total sovereign debt.
And this is something that we could see at Ostrum Asset Management because we regularly meet with treasuries, namely when they come on roadshows. And several of them, during their presentation, have integrated a part on climate. So in general, they show their energy mix, its evolution, or their climate goals. And we saw some countries like Austria that we met some months ago went even further and attempted to provide us with a global view of their management of environmental, social, and governance aspect by displaying their ESG ranking according to several data providers. And they also display their SDG index ranking, which measures their achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that more and more investors are initiating a dialogue with sovereign issuers. So this should raise more awareness among them of ESG issues.
But despite all of this, things are moving at a slower pace than what could be expected, wouldn't you say? I mean, it seems there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yes, I fully agree. There's even a report from the UN that has been released end of 2023 on the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And it shows that countries are falling behind in achieving these goals because these goals have been set in 2015. And so we're really halfway to the 2030 deadline. So this report is quite alarming because it shows that for 50% of the goals behind the 17 SDGs, the progress is weak and insufficient. And even for 30% of them, the countries are stagnating or regressing.
Yes, similarly, the situation is very complicated for emerging countries, which are suffering a double whammy of poor credit ratings from rating agencies, but also a poor ESG score. These countries have a high level of debt and are therefore unable to attract foreign investors to finance their green transition. To overcome this difficulty, international financial institutions such as the World Bank or the IMF have created special programs such as the IMF Resilience Fund.
So after hearing this, we can ask ourselves the following question. Are managers able to assess the ESG dimension of sovereign debt in the same way as they do for corporate debt?
Yes, asset managers are able to assess the ESG dimension of sovereign debts and have the necessary tools and methodologies to integrate this consideration into their analysis and investment decision, much like they do for corporate debts. Increasingly, tools and methodologies have been developed to help us evaluate the ESG performance of sovereign debt issuers. These tools include dedicated internal analysts for sustainable bonds, ESG rating agencies, governable sustainability reports, data on CO2 emission and other environmental factors. All these elements are taken into account in the evaluation of the ESG dimension of sovereign debts.
Timothée, you've spoken of the tools that are used in the industry, but what about at Ostrum?
So at Ostrum, we use the SDG index. As I said before, it's a tool which aims to measure the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by each country. And we particularly like this index because it's available in open source. It's very transparent. We have access to the whole methodology and also to raw indicators, which helps a lot in the analysis. And we also like it because it has quite a broad coverage. So it also covers emerging countries in which we are invested. And it is based on recognized criteria from international organizations like the World Bank or the IMF. And so the SDG index, and we use it in particular for our funds, which are Article 8 under SFDR rule. So what we do is we take the average SDG index score of the sovereign fund, and it should be higher than the average rating of the benchmark. And for majority of funds, we add another rule. We also look at the carbon intensity. So it's the same. We look at the average carbon intensity of the sovereign pocket, and it should be better than the benchmark. So in this case, it should be lower. So in the end, this means that the SDG index score and the carbon intensity have a direct influence on investment and or allocation decision, which leads us to a preference for countries with good management of E, S, and G issues.
I would add that for sustainable bonds, we have internally developed proprietary tools to analyze the quality of projects.
To recap all that's been said today, we need to ask ourselves the following question. Can sovereign debt be an effective way to invest responsibly?
Yes, sovereign debt can be very effective in that way. When governments use the funds to finance environmentally friendly or socially beneficial projects, such as those related to education or healthcare. We've seen that with the European Union and the Next Generation EU initiative. It's an example of a large-scale green financing efforts. Although the climate commitment made by sovereigns are sometimes too timid, responsible investment is making an effective contribution to the transition to a sustainable future. Dialogues with sovereign issuers provide an opportunity to transparently assess the accountability of their ESG practices, complementing the implementation of public policies arising from the SDGs.
Yes, I fully agree with Timothée. I also think sovereign debt can be an effective way to invest responsibly, and especially with this development of dialogue with sovereign issuers. So at Ostrum Asset Management, we already have, since several years, an engagement policy on corporates. And we decided beginning of 2023 to extend it to sovereign issuers. The goal being really to conduct dialogue with them and to understand if they're lagging behind on some SDG, why is it so, what are the strategies in place, what are the means and the resources that they plan to use. And so this is, of course, on the SDGs, but in particular on the climate issues. And I would also say that there's a pressing need on this climate issue for financing, so to reduce the CO2 emissions, but also to adapt to the effects of climate change. And this is fueling the relevance of sovereign debt in responsible investment strategies.
Yes, Léonie is raising a very important point. To conclude, the increasing engagement of investors with sovereign issuer is a very important lever for raising awareness, enhancing the readiness of these issuers to integrate ESG issues, thus strengthening the role of sovereign debt in the ESG investment opportunities.
Thank you, Timothée, for these last remarks. Thank you, Léonie, for these fruitful discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us for the first episode of Transitions, Ostrum Asset Management's new podcast. Stay tuned and find us on all the main podcast platforms, on our social media channels, and on our website, www.ostrum.com. See you soon on Transitions.